Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Glad to have you back for day 2 of Courageous Conversations. My name is Malik Blade, and I'll be your moderator for today. And I'd like to introduce you to the panelists, starting with my far left. John, could you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm John Onwuchekwa. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. I pastored for 16 years, and after 16 years of pastoring, I moved out, and I'm still a member at the church that I started. And so right now, I'm an entrepreneur and author, and I serve as the director of resources at Christianity Today.
Thanks. Dr. Edmondson?
Yeah, good morning. My name is Dr. Christina Edmondson. It's really great to be with you, and shout out to Lisa Fields. And I just wanted to publicly honor her leadership, and I get to teach leadership, and she is par excellence in leadership, behind the scenes. So I just wanted to take a moment to say that out loud. My background, I'm a psychologist by training and educator as well. I'm one of the co-hosts and co-founders of the Truth Table podcast. Yes. Listen and rate and review, okay? And I also, behind the scenes, get to work with a number of organizations, both secular and Christian, in areas of mediation, conflict resolution, and ethics.
Dr. Brown?
Good morning. My name is Jessica Brown. I'm also a clinical psychologist by training and really work at all the intersections of faith and mental health. So I help people to think about how faith impacts the way they understand and respond to their mental health symptoms. How do we attend to mental health in the context of church communities? And also helping clergy to be well and attend to their own mental health.
And Pastor Sharpe?
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I'm just a pastor. I serve the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago. Come on, Chicago. And I'm from the suburbs of Atlanta. I'm currently pursuing a PhD in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric at Christian Theological Seminary, so I need a whole lot of prayer.
Thank you for that. And before we jump in, we want to make resources available to you because we understand that when we talk about this idea of church hurt, it overlaps with emotions and mental health as well. So please be aware of the resources outside in the lobby via the Whole Brother Mission to bring mental health services to you personally or to your church or nonprofit organization. But we can share more about that later. With this first question, we want to start off with definitions so we understand what we're talking about. Because when we say, how do I heal from church hurt, sometimes the perception of what that means can be different from person to person. So we want to start off with defining exactly what church hurt is for you, because we know there's a difference between a minor inconvenience, an offense, just not meeting your preferences, and church hurt. So we want to kind of clarify what exactly are we talking about. So anyone that wants to jump out there, how would you define church hurt specifically?
I can start. So for me, church hurt is pain which leads to distance from God, right? And in the context of churches, often it's relational, but whatever has happened, whether it's an interpersonal event, whether it's a traumatic experience, that causes us to feel like we can't connect to our spiritual source.
I think that is a phenomenal definition. And I think the one thing that I would add to that is it's an injury without regards to intent, right? So intent is inconsequential, right? So when it comes to church hurt, it's like, first degree murder and involuntary manslaughter both leave families at funerals. And so with church hurt, I think sometimes it's invalidated due to intent. And at that point, we're just talking about, was it first degree murder or involuntary manslaughter? That it still does leave that hole or that grief when it comes to relationship with God.
Got it. You got some snaps.
Yeah. I didn't get any for my intro, so I'm trying to make up.
You got to make up.
Thank you.
There you go. So when I think about church hurt, I think about the phrase more of like kind of a colloquialism. It's kind of pop culture terminology at this point, church hurt. And so I try to, terms really matter to me because then we can think about it diagnostically and also legally. Because some people have experienced church hurt, which could be a misalignment of expectations. And some people have experienced spiritual abuse and religious abuse. And they have experienced a type of spiritual abuse which has manifested in their home as well. And so when we're thinking about abuse, we're thinking about a misuse of power to misuse people. And it's helpful for us to be able to distinguish between those two things, spiritual abuse, because sometimes we need to call the police, and church hurt, which could be that, I've been on this committee for a long time, okay, and I expected to keep it, right? And now you've moved it over to Sister Jenkins. That could be an issue of expectations not being met, right? And so we want to separate, I like to separate the language a bit from church hurt, disappointment, versus spiritual abuse, which in that instance, we're talking about how we need to think about someone's overall mental health and care, and depending on what the issue is, whether or not we also need to bring in different authorities.
I really want to just jump in right here and say something quick. I appreciate you breaking that down, because spiritual abuse is real, and a lot of pastors in particular are guilty of masking rebuke and correction, and what's really happening is an abuse of power. But at the core of what I feel, a lot of what people are experiencing is not necessarily, and I'm not dismissing that spiritual abuse is real, but it's more of that misaligned expectations. That I assume because this is church, people are going to be kind, compassionate, they're not going to cuss, I can trust them, they're not going to be liars. And the truth is, wherever there are people, there will be problems. There is a Judas in the bunch. There's going to be a liar. Somebody is going to disappoint you. And I think because it happens at church, it becomes exacerbated to say, I can't believe this happened to me at a place I assumed I would be healed and not wounded. And so I think all of those things make this conversation even more broader and nuanced, and I appreciate you all's definitions.
Can I ask a question to them up here, just before we start, right, to start to broaden things? I loved your definition, the misuse of power to misuse people. I think sometimes when it comes to church hurt, conversations feel unilateral, because often the people with the most power in the church are the pastor. How would you broaden it to maybe include the church where, oh, no, there's this church, and the most influential person with the most power in this church is actually not the pastor, it's a member, right? So how would you, would you broaden the definition to include, like, does power necessarily mean positional power? Or does it mean, like, emergent power that just comes with influence in the church?
Yeah, there are all kinds of forms of power, right? From the person who's paid a lot of money, and they expect that means that they can decide what songs are sung and not sung. So there, true stories.
Speaking from experience.
True stories. Right. So power really can be positional in terms of the title, but it could also be power that we are able to exercise because of the resources that we have, because of maybe family legacy, because of physical power, our own kind of physical intimidation of others. I would recommend that people, leaders, whether that's positionally or just as influencers, do a power audit, which is a humbling thing to do, because oftentimes even pastors will say, like, I don't have as much power as people think I do. But doing a power audit helps us to sit down and say, who do I influence? Who don't I have to even explain myself to? Who assumes that I'm credible, right? And those are that's a way of thinking about a power audit, because if we don't recognize the power that we have, there is no way we can hold ourselves accountable in how we use it.
Sure. So I want to take a sharp pivot here, because I see us going toward talking about those people that may have experienced church hurt over there. But I want to take a sharp turn and ask you personally, especially considering from a pastor's perspective as well. Have you experienced church hurt?
Absolutely.
Yes.
110%. I've been Black and Baptist all my life. And it doesn't take long to realize that, hey, people will people. And so I've tried not to just call it church hurt because, we don't walk around and claim barbershop hurt or
Club hurt.
Kroger hurt. I mean, we just hurt because people disappointed. Sometimes you just hurt because people disappointed you. I've been on both sides of the fence where I have been a victim of spiritual abuse. And I've also been, I'm gonna be very honest. Let me give you three real quick. I've been a victim of spiritual abuse. I have been hurt from people in the pews. And I have hurt and harmed people and never knew I was hurting them.
Yeah.
And I've had to do some apologizing as a pastor. Yeah. Because I've sent people to therapy and didn't find out till 4 or 5 months later that something I said harmed them in that involuntary way.
Right.
But I still had a responsibility to do my part to try to reconcile it. But let me hone in on what happened from the pew. What happened from the pew was a member who made a lot of money and thought that money qualified them to pastor me. Once told me, I don't hear your education in your preaching. Now, this is the same person who listened to, can we call names? How deep can we go?
Well, if you call names, you might cause some more church hurt.
Well, there was a white pastor that comes on TV a whole lot that hadn't been to school at all, and this particular person watches them regularly and compared my preaching style to their preaching style. And what I discovered is you can't hear education in my preaching, but the person you listen to every week on TV, on TBN, doesn't have an education at all. So what are we talking about here? And it came down to the fact that I was a hooper and sometimes the organist hits E flat. My style was not appreciated. But what they didn't realize happened was I spent the next 7 months in therapy because he hit a place in me that I had to relive from a child where I wasn't enough. So I've been to Morehouse, Vanderbilt, Yale, and in a PhD program, preached at Hampton Ministers Conference, spoke at E.K. Bailey, and you telling me you don't hear my education? So it doesn't matter what I do, I'm not enough. So now as a pastor, I got to stand in the pulpit and pretend I don't see you on the second row. When what you just said reminds me of something my daddy said. So I'm telling you that when you broaden this conversation, I think that the pew needs to be careful that sometimes what you say and do to your pastor or leaders in the ministry can also send them to therapy as well. Yeah. That's just, I heard a all. God bless you. I'm better now. I didn't cuss them out. God is working on me.
Perfect.
I got more to say, but I'm a hush.
I'm sure.
But I think that demonstrates, right, like how part of the reason it's so prevalent and part of the reason it's become a part of our colloquial conversation is because we all have those internal points of us or parts of our experience that we haven't yet done all the work that there is to be done around, right? That we're in process. And me just walking around in church, me just saying whatever comes to mind, I have no way of knowing what somebody's internal process is, right? So one of the lessons here is we don't go wrong when we are just gentle with people. Yeah. Right? When we think about my words might have more power or more sting than they feel like when I'm saying them, but I don't know what somebody's internal experience is, and I don't know how long they're going to carry that thing that felt like an offhanded comment to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, you look like you.
Well, what I want to say is I think that you're right because I just left Ghana last week, and one of the brothers told me, he said, we have to be careful with our words because your words have power to pinch somebody's heart. And sometimes you don't get to determine how their heart is unpinched. And I believe that when you're saying come at people with a gentleness and a compassion, both pulpit, pew, leadership, whoever, I think we need more compassion in how we deal with folks because trauma is real and you don't know what you're pinching when you say a little sentence that may hit and trigger something from 10, 12 years ago.
So, to your question, have you experienced church hurt? So
Yeah.
I started pastoring when I was 22, and I stopped at 38. So 16 years. Before we planted our church in the West End, this is 8.5 years ago, 6 weeks before the church planted, my brother died. Buried him 2 weeks after he died. 4 weeks later, was in the pulpit and started this church plant. And over the course of that next year, we had a very, very young church, and everybody was experiencing loss after loss after loss. And it was interesting to be in that seat and to see how the rest of the church cared for everybody else, and how the assumption was made, right, that because you're a leader, you're cut from a different cloth, and anybody in here that's led, right? So it's like the hurt didn't come at that time by active words of rebuke, but there is a type of hurt that comes from neglect, right? You can kill these beautiful flowers just by not watering them. And so there is a type of hurt that comes from there. And so it's, experiencing both types, right? Just through the years.
Yeah, I think it's a super helpful question. It's one I think that most of us are a bit slow to even answer because it requires a certain level of vulnerability to be able to lean into that. And sometimes it can also take time to be able to look back and to call something what it actually was. So it takes us to be able to do some introspection and retrospection to say, oh, that's what that was. There's a name for it. I would say that I certainly have experienced both church hurt, so kind of a misalignment of expectations and disappointment, some very reasonable expectations and some maybe unreasonable expectations on my part. And I've also experienced spiritual abuse. And I would say that I'm grateful that I experienced those things post the age of 30. So I had 3 decades in the church of witnessing my mother, who's a deacon, love God and love the people. I witnessed her being, yesterday was her birthday party, so she's fresh on my mind. But I witnessed her really thoughtful about the way that she spoke about leadership, not making an idol out of them, which some people do, that's super unhealthy, but in a way in which I could tell she was careful about being cautious about defaming their reputation and always leaning into curiosity instead of condemnation of pastoral leadership, recognizing they have a difficult job, one that if you've not been behind the scene, you may not know just how difficult and layered that job is. And so I'm grateful for having that as my roots, my experience. So I didn't have to be convinced post 30 when I experienced church hurt and spiritual abuse that wasn't all people, because I knew it wasn't all Christians. I knew that wasn't all churches. But I do think for many people, the experiences that they have had are so painful that, rightfully so, it causes them to second guess even their own discernment going forward. Healing from spiritual abuse in church hurt, just to close out what I'm saying here, with church hurt, that was me having the opportunity to do some of my own work. Right? So without victim blaming, when it's church hurt, I can say like, well, were my expectations reasonable? Right? And sometimes they may have been or may not have been, but I knew that there wasn't malice per se. With spiritual abuse, one of the things that's going to be important is exercising one's agency. So there are some people who are reclaiming their own health, having experienced spiritual abuse by exercising the agency to say, I'm not walking into that church building right now. That's a way of them maybe having agency taken away, grabbing hold of it again. And it could look to other people like maybe they're being stubborn or unreasonable or rigid or unforgiving, but what they really are doing is trying to retain a sense of agency when it has been robbed from them. And there's a place for that. There's a season for that as they continue to do their healing work.
Dr. Edmondson, I'm glad you said that because that's actually was going to be one of the next questions so we can have everyone kind of give their input on this. Some of you may have been in a church context where there was somewhat of a competition of people keeping tabs on how many Sundays you attend. And if you miss too many, then you're drifting away from God, right? So let's just put the question out there. Is it possible, is there room, is there something healing or helpful about not going to any church for a period of time?
So the nuance I would add there is, particularly in the context of having experienced church hurt or spiritual abuse, it's important for our spiritual practices not to be totally located inside a church, right? So we have to have our own spiritual connection. We have to have our own prayer life. We need to have our own disciplines that shape our faith walk. And so for those of us who are searching, sometimes those personal practices are the things that keep us connected at all, because the church life feels so unsafe in many ways. I think part of agency can be taking a period away from organized religion to figure out, what do I believe, and in what type of community will I feel safe and loved? Right? So I think a part of the reworking is to get to know myself well enough to know, where can I feel safe? And sometimes that takes time away for clarity and perspective.
Before we move on, could you unpack what you mean by taking time away from organized religion?
Yeah, so, I think there's a spectrum. It could be, so, to the earlier question around church hurt, I grew up as the daughter of a pastor, so I could write many books about church hurt, right? And so for me, going to college was the first time it ever occurred to me that I had a choice about whether to go to church or not. Like, nobody was having discussions in my home about whether we were going to church. It was just how many services we were going to that Sunday. So during college, I was involved in the gospel choir. I had my personal spiritual devotions, but it was like an experiment in some ways for me to not go to church for a Sunday or two, to just see. Like, if it's really just me and God, and I'm not being coached to do a certain thing or say a certain thing, what is my relationship like, right? And so I didn't denounce Christianity, but I realized that my faith was bigger and broader than what I was doing on Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock, right? And so I think that can be really important. Some people have a searching process where they're seeing what people in other religions or denominations believe, just to test, right? Like, do I believe this? Do I believe that? What does that sound like, right? And that's why it's important to have conversation with people who believe different things than we believe. For many of us, there might be a returning home process, but my conversations with Buddhists and Jews and Hindus have helped me to be sure about what I believe, right? And so I think there's opportunity as we're engaged in a healing process to just see what else is in the world. And then if and when we return home, we can do that from a place of steadiness and from a place of really being sure that what I believe is not just something that's been fed to me, but something that I hold true for myself. That's especially true in the context of spiritual abuse, where the power dynamic is such that you are taught what to believe. It's a top-down thing, and often in those situations, if you dare to question, you're told that that's an abomination, or you get slapped for doing that, right? And so to be able to say, I believe what I believe because I know it and because I feel it, rather than I believe what I believe because somebody told me to believe it, is a really different experience, and it can be freeing.
Anyone else, can time away from church be helpful or healing?
Yeah. So I think I would answer that, right? Can time away be helpful or healing? Yes. But I think one of the things that I would just say or add to that is that when it comes to spiritual abuse or church hurt, I think that is the most popular, prevalent, and expected reflex. And so I think what I would just want to do is to say that possibly could work, but there are other reflexes that should at least be considered. One of which is this. My therapist, we talk often about corrective emotional experiences, right? So I know what it's like to be a part of a church and have your labor exploited, your capital exploited. I know what it's like to be a part of denominations where when you speak out, up at the top people are very wicked, they're very wealthy, and they're very well protected, right? So you talk about hurt from an institutional and a personal level. I know that. And I do think that sometimes the reflex of being able to step away is one thing. But there's also, and I just started reading this book last week. It's by this guy by the name of Ross Gay, called Book of Delights. And what he just brings up is he said, hey, one day, every day for the next year, I want to write a short reflection on an unexpected delight that I saw in life. As he writes it, in the preface of the book, he said, writing that every day changed me. Because I realized that often my complaints, or he didn't use these words, but my complaints are often written in bold and capital letters. And the delights that God sent are in 8-point, italicized, very thin font, sometimes in wingdings, right? I don't even know what I'm reading. But what he said was the more that I started to write, the more that I saw that I was actually drowning in delights that my complaints made it hard for me to see. And so for him, it was an exercise on reflecting on the good that was a corrective emotional experience, which I think should be a reflex that is considered as strongly as absence from the church, right? Reflecting on the presence of the goodness of God. And I think that if we'll take a swath and say, there's a host of reflexes that we can choose to do, then I think that when somebody does take time away from the church, it's not because that was the one and only option. It was, I considered it amongst all of this, and based on where I am right now, this seemed like the best choice, not my only choice.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
My mind is just flooded with thoughts, and I'm grateful. Thank you for sharing that book. So the first thought I have is a lot of what we talk about is individualized church hurt, but we cannot talk about that without discussing institutional, theological, systemic powers and hegemonic forces at work that really do harm more people than good. And excuse me for keep talking about this Ghana trip because my life has changed. You know, you go home one time and you change.
Come on.
And so we went to the slave dungeons, and the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Dutch intentionally built chapels and churches on top of the slaves. So as I stood there, I looked up, I said, isn't this something? They were having church on top of people. And the Spirit spoke to me and said, yeah, but over in America, y'all are still having church on top of people. And we have got to address the ways our church, our being, our very presence in the society and community has church on top of the LGBTQIA community, on top of trans folk, on top of homeless and houseless folks. We're having church on top of a lot of people, and I feel like we have to address, when you say, do we need to leave? Well, if you're going to continuously have church on top of me and not have church for me, with me, or in consideration of my being and personhood, then maybe I do need to exit from this space, because it is death dealing. It is death dealing to stay in some of our churches. Now, wherever you land theologically, and I know I just took a turn where this could all end in a wreck, but or I could be wrecked for saying it. But what I'm trying to say, regardless of where this lands, is that we need to be more cognizant. Instead of blaming people for walking away from church, did they have legitimate reason to walk away and say deuces because I refuse to sit and be harmed and bullied and insulted simply because we may not agree on ideology or theology? So sometimes the saints do need to leave or go find a church where your personhood is not a threat to whatever hegemonic forces at power. I'm telling you, I got some scattering thoughts. Can I share one more? All right. Yes, I'm trying to behave. So the other piece is, for those who've been individually wounded, my advice is stop no, I mean, I say stop. I'll invite you to consider. Don't leave that church without telling somebody what made you feel like I need to leave this church. I cannot tell you how many things could have been rectified, how many issues could have been solved, how many apologies could have been given if the person that dipped had just had enough courage. Or I don't know. I mean, because there's so many power dynamics at bay. So you're telling people to speak up against the folks in power, and sometimes it's frightening. But I'm telling you, I don't care how frightening it is, that church deserves to hear your voice. That pastor, that leader, whoever deserves to hear whatever has been done to harm. So even if they don't listen, at least you can leave in peace and say, I told him what's up. So even if you get kicked out like Vashti, hey, you may kick me out, but I'm going to tell you I ain't going to be naked for you. I'm going to tell you I'm not doing it. And if that's the cost of keeping this crown, you can have the crown and the kingdom. And I'm going to leave, but I'm not going to leave without telling you what pissed me off and what disappointed me. And pastors and leaders, y'all, we got to do better. Our egos need to be in check. We need to be in therapy so we don't think everybody that has a critique or a concern is trying to fight you. Everybody that brings a suggestion is not trying to fight us. So we have to be humble enough to say, yes, Sister Sharpe, I hear you, and I'm going to make sure that we do a little bit better. But some of us in leadership, we need healing first. Amen.
So, Pastor Sharpe, you went there, so let's keep going.
No.
And this does need to be said or asked, because y'all got to talk about it. So, obviously, differences of point of view, opinion, theology do cause people to leave churches and can lead to church hurt, right? So, you know, in previous years here at Courageous Conversations, there have been talks about the authority of Scripture, inclusivity, exclusivity, sexuality. Everyone has different points of view on what's a primary, secondary, or tertiary issue. So this is a very wide net I'm casting here, but how would you all counsel someone to process through whether or not something is hurting them or helping them, whether to leave or not, depending on the topic? Because some things may be a red flag. If they say this, you got to get out of there. And other things may be, well, maybe you should talk to the eldership about that more. So how would you counsel someone to process through what is worth exit, stage left, versus what is leaning more for a conversation?
Right, so everything is up for conversation. And if you are in a ministry where the thrice holy God, who is sovereign, can tolerate your questions, but people won't tolerate your questions, that's a problem. So everything should be up for conversation, because one of the roles of the church is equipping people and teaching people and helping people to grow. So we should assume that people have different perspectives that are in the pew. And if we are laying something out as a conviction, particularly a biblical conviction, then we have to lay that out over and over again in ways that are clear and loving and deeply founded in our sources of credibility. So if your church says that Scripture is a source of high credibility, then that is what people need to be surrounding their teaching and thinking around. And so you should be able to open the text and ask people, help to make this plain for me. Make this plain. And if you have leadership that says, no, we've done that, or we're tired of talking to you, or you don't get to ask us questions, these are signs that you got a problem, okay? With that being said, churches need to do their very best to show their cards, to do their very best to show their convictions so that people they can basically have a very intentional kind of active consent of what people can consent to what they're participating in. Now, with that being said, there are leaders sometimes who are figuring out what they think and what they believe real time. But with that being said, I think it's only fair that leader, again, demonstrates humility by saying, we're working through this ourselves. Yeah. And that frees the people up to say, oh, we're all a work in progress. This pastor, this person is not closer to Jesus than I am. They don't have a particular revelation that I may not have myself, right? And so it's important, I think, for us to be thinking about how we can create church communities that welcome difficult questions and redundant questions over and over again, and churches that show their cards, they show their convictions, they show what they believe on a whole manner of topics. One of the questions when and I often joke with people when we're thinking about coaching around hiring or ordination or something like that. I say, I don't hire headaches. I don't recommend headaches. I wouldn't ordain headaches. So I don't intentionally say, this is going to be a problem. Let me go give you some more power. So what you want to see, one of the ways I vet for that is by asking people questions like this. What are the conditions for you as a leader in which you would be able to recognize and say to us, I am no longer equipped to do this role? Because I need leaders to be thinking about what their exit looks like. We only have one eternal home, and that's in glory. The pulpit is not an eternal home. And so if you have a pastor who cannot envision themselves departing, one, because they have something else to do in life that the Lord has called them to, or also because they may not personally be healthy enough or healthy enough in the way they're leading the church, then we have a problem. It is a privilege to be in the back pew of the house of the Lord. But no one is owed the pulpit.
Before we continue, I do want everyone to chime in if interested. But I want to just give one alert. So in about 8 minutes, we're going to transition to our time of Q&A, where you will be able to send questions in. So they should put this, there it is, QR code where you're able to submit questions to the panel. And we'll be transitioning to that in about 8 minutes. But feel free, everyone. Would you like to chime in on that last question?
Can you repeat the last question?
Sure.
You did such a great job answering that I
don't
know what else
so,
to say.
In terms of order of importance, how would you counsel someone to process through differences of ideology at a church? Some things may be seen as leave immediately, others may be open for discussion. How would you counsel someone to process through those differences?
So I think we've been circling around this, but I'll just put a pin on it and say, I think there's a difference between leaving a church and leaving the church.
Amen.
Right? So that's one question. Mm-hmm. Am I thinking about leaving this church or am I thinking about leaving the church? Right? Those are really different questions. Because the first question is about doctrine and about the other kinds of cultural pieces that churches can take on as a personality, right? Can be. And so for me, in my clinical practice, if I'm working with somebody who's working through these things, a part of the conversation is the conflict that you're experiencing right now, how deeply or widely is this affecting you, right? Are you just mad at this one person in your church? Not to say that that's not something to talk about, but that's different than I have a physiological response when I look at my church driving down the street, right? And so I think we need to think about how intense the pain is, right? Is it affecting me at multiple levels? I've had people come to me and say, I've been so hurt by this that I can't even access my personal prayer life, right? And so I think those kinds of pieces are different than, can I build some skills to really address this conflict head on and say, hey, you said something and it hurt me. Right, so the intensity of it matters. The resources a person has, both internally and externally, matter. If you leave this church, do you have other sources of social support? Do you have other people in your life who can support you on your faith journey, right? And so we need to get into the individualized experience to help people determine how they make those decisions with the awareness that two people can be in the same church, experience the same kind of issue, and their response to it that would be healthiest for them could be very different.
Thank you, Dr. Jessica. Let me say, so this is the example I hear in my head. There's a person who is a part of the LGBTQIA community, and the church says, hey, y'all, according to Paul, according to Romans, according to Leviticus, we just believe this is a sin. And homosexuality, transsexuality, bisexuality, it's a sin, and that's where we stand on it. I know some people who are still able to attend that church as long as, if you believe it's a sin, you don't get in the pulpit every Sunday and act like it's the only sin. And so, are y'all following me with that? So it's like, all right, cool, I got you. We don't see eye to eye. For me, this is where I am. This is how I identify. And my church that I support, love, been going to all my life, I can still go because at least if they believe it's a sin, I've reconciled enough that my pastor doesn't get up and only preach on this sin like it's the only sin. But he's also talking about liars and also talking about manipulators and also talking about adultery and also talking about other things and saying, hey, all have sinned. And so we're not going to focus in on one. So I feel like you can stay at a church even where you may have subtle theological, philosophical, ideological differences when love is still at the heart of the ministry. And I don't know, and that doesn't sound profound, but for me, I can almost deal with any difference in theology with anybody as long as we can meet in the center with some love, compassion, respect for each other. Then that's a ministry that you might be able to stay at as long as love is at the core of it. And there are more conversations than there are crucifixions. But if we just gonna kill people because they don't think like us, that's not a safe space to be in. But if we can have conversations and I can push back and I can challenge, and then the pastor, the leader, whoever, Sunday school teacher, pushes back, hey, as long as we can meet on the grounds of love. But as I heard somebody say that you are sin because of their lifestyle, I heard that said before. You are sin. Now, if you're going to look at me and call me sin, number one, you might want to duck. And number two, I don't think that represents the heart of Jesus Christ. I think you got to meet people with love.
One last thing before we transition to our Q&A very quickly. Can you share some examples? What does this spiritual abuse look like? Because sometimes it's covert or not easily seen or branded as something else. What does spiritual abuse look like? What does a healthy church look like?
I'm going to start really just by way of giving an introduction to Dr. Christina. One of the things that I found is that sometimes the pastor or the leader that is in the midst of it, that has been accused of spiritual abuse, is actually the worst person to diagnose if that is the case or not. So we've had instances within the little network that we had where that took place, and we realized that we aren't qualified and we are too close to the situation to absolve or to indict anybody. And so what we did was, not just call somebody like her, we literally called Dr. Edmondson and we said, hey, would you come in and would you help us, right? So when it comes to decision making, I think one of the best things that we can do is ensure that those of us that do have power or influence don't make such pivotal decisions in isolation, but we bring somebody else in to help. And so that's just my way of serving up the platter for you to answer this question for everybody. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, John. So one of the most, I think, grievous things people can do as they misuse power and misuse people is that they, if they have a position of spiritual authority, is that they can not only do wrong themselves towards a person or a family in the context of the church, but they can enlist other members to join them in that. And I have seen that puppeteering done in ways that are so painful and so hurtful to people and so scarring. And I think that many people can get over this idea of this was this one pastor or this one person that was disappointing. But it is when the church gets on board and become complicit in the abuse and misuse of other people that we start to get the kind of scars that are very, very deep and very hard to heal. One example that comes to mind for me is a young woman that I was counseling when she was in college. And I remember she represents many, many people who I have counseled, whether they were PKs or just church members or missionary kids as well. But she had experienced complex trauma, and one of the significant incidences that caused that trauma was related to a youth pastor who had misused his power to misuse her. And not only was that painful enough and all the manipulation about what it would mean for her to be a good girl and to participate and to do what he said, it was the way in which the church villainized her. Language describing 14 and 15-year-old girls because of the development of their bodies, like fast. It was the culmination of that and the pleas from the senior pastor saying, well, we don't want to ruin his life. You should be forgiving. It was that ecosystem. It was really that mob business, that organized criminality of the church that caused that pain to go as deep as it did. And that type of spiritual abuse, we got to run from it. We got to call it out. We got to get the proper authorities. We might need to call the police, right? And so those are the kind of questions that we need to be asking about, even as we're vetting and thinking about healthy and safe ministries, is asking, what are the conditions that you take in order to keep this community healthy, and which everyone is accountable to?
Quickly, did you have anything you'd like to add before we transition to our Q&A time?
No, sir.
Amen. Amen. All right. So first question, and I'll say, in light of how our conversation has progressed, our top 3 questions with the most upvotes actually have to do with sexuality. So here's our first. I'll just start it. Both of my children are gay. As a parent, I have nothing but unconditional love for them. However, various churches have turned their backs on my children, and this is hurtful. How do I heal from this?
I'll quickly start by saying this. When the church turns its back on anyone, there's a statement that's being made there. And then I recognize we're in a space where there are some people who would look at issues of sexuality and use language around sin, and there are others who would not. Regardless of what camp you stand in, I will say this. When we say that the church cannot handle it or they turn their backs on people, that is a statement about the love, the reach, and the depth of our thrice holy God. And there is no one who is out of the reach of God's grace and God's mercy. And so we don't throw people away. We don't disown people, whether we believe that this is a matter of sin or not. Because God's reach is that deep. It reached to me, and it can reach to my children, and it can reach to my neighbor, and it can reach to my enemy. And that is the type of gospel preaching that we need in this country and that we need in this world. One that is not intimidated by one's orientation, but one that says, I know a God who is the creator of all things, whose love is wide, broad, and expansive. And everything that God wants you to be, that God can get you to be that. And that's for people who are progressive or conservative on these issues, that God is the creator and God has the final say. And so I think that, for me, that is where I would start, is this sense of knowing that when we talk about folks like they're out of the reach of the holy arm of God, one, we don't have a good sense of the depths of our own sin and our own brokenness and our own wickedness. And that is a part of my theology, is that the Lord had to come and get me, had to come and rescue me, that I was an enemy of God. That's my theology. And that by his love that was irresistible, he called me unto himself. And so this is a God who created humans, and he can recreate, and he can refashion, and he can do whatever he wants. He can leave you just as you are to the glory of God. He can leave you just as you are to the glory of God to show forth that God is not done with you. So I think that type of gospel, for me, that's biblical gospel. And it is not intimidated by our brokenness, our weaknesses, our sins, our besetting sins, our issues. It's a gospel that says, come, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I will give you rest.
Yeah. I agree. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And are you free tomorrow to preach in Chicago? Because I need you to say all that all over again. No, that's great. Like, my fear for the church of the future is that if we don't get this together, people are going to keep leaving and finding alternative communities of love. So the reference of this biblically is the pool of Bethesda. they're gathered around, and the reason they're there is because the church has a theology that says if you have any physical differences, you're cursed. Something's wrong with you. So the man at the pool of Bethesda and all of these who are blind and all of these who have some kind of malady or illness, they're there because the church pushed them to the pool. And if we're not careful, I hope that this question is a reminder to all of us who are leaders in churches that this is what we do to people. And they're going to continue to go to brunch at 12 in the middle of your church service. They're going to continue to find other group therapy sessions in the city, wherever they can go to feel the love of God. And isn't that a sad indictment on us that people would have to find God's love somewhere other than the place that was called God's house? So I feel like that question, whoever wrote it, I'm sorry that you've had that experience, but don't think that every church is that kind of church. There is a space that will let you know God loves you just like you are. And I pray that you find that space of healing. And I pray all of our churches and ministries and whatever can be that kind of space of wholeness and healing.
Yeah, and I want to respond to that as a parent, right? Because for me, one of my ultimate responsibilities as a parent is to protect my children, right? I'm not a fighter, but mess with one of my babies, right? And so I think we as parents, and even in the church, as we conjure this parental image of God, right? Like, think about all that goes into that. So we have a right and responsibility as parents to think about, am I helping my children to grow in a way that they can really understand the heart and character of God, right? And to be able to distinguish that from people who are often misguided. So for me, I would have two options there. One, if I feel like I have the space to do that, I'm thinking about, how can I tell people what it's costing our family that my children don't feel like they have a place here? Right? So it goes to your earlier point around, when we have the power, we have an opportunity to say, we're not living into all of what God is calling us to be. And because I love this community, I'm going to hold us to a standard, right? So we have that option. But we also have the option to find spaces and places where our children can be loved and supported. Sometimes that's a supplement to the faith community that we're a part of, and sometimes it's the transplant situation where we find another faith community that can really help to affirm, right? And I say that and understand, if that means that I as a parent am thinking about transitioning from a church that I've been at my whole life, right? That's a complicated situation. So I don't think it's an easy place to be. But I also think a big piece of healing, whether it's from church hurt, whether it's from trauma, whether it's from spiritual abuse, is to recognize that we are not powerless, right? And so any action that you can take toward your own healing or for the protection of your own family is helpful to you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next question. How do you talk to people in church who believe that not affirming same-sex relationships is part of the church's oppression? Sure. Yeah, if you could leave it on the screen. How do you talk to people in church who believe that not affirming same-sex relationships is part of the church's oppression?
I don't know if I understand the way it was worded. Are they saying that, okay, how do you talk to people in church who believe they're not affirming same sex? I'm confused by the question.
So if there are people in the church, that believe that if the church is not affirming, that itself is oppressive. So
Yeah.
How would you speak to someone that has that point of view?
Oh, I would tell them it's oppressive.
Yeah.
And we need to call a spade a spade. And I know I'm simple in some ways. I'm from Georgia, but I ain't crazy. You have got to call a spade a spade. And it is oppressive if, like I said, every time that's the only thing we want to talk about. If this is what I believe, if this is how I identify, I'm in a same gender-loving relationship. There are ways to have that conversation without it landing in an oppressive way. And I think the main thing is that it needs to be a conversation.
So I do think that this question is very general and contextless. And as you answer, you're putting it in a very specific context, right? That I do think there is an oppressive way to do that, but this question is asking if somebody were to not affirm and to say, hey, I actually affirm what some would call a historical Christian sexual ethic that's not just rooted in problem passages, but my biblical theology, as I trace through the whole thing, says that God views marriage in this light. I think what they're saying here is, how do you have conversations where, regardless of how much you nuance it, the rest of or lots of folks in the world would say that what I just said is oppressive, right? So that's where I think I do agree with you that a pastor in a pulpit that bullies a particular sin as if it's the only one or the main one, that is an oppressive way to treat that. But towards this, what I would say is one of the first things that I would do is I would untether this question from similar questions of race and injustice and oppression that way. I feel like that we live in a world that is tying those shoelaces together, and those are two shoes on different feet, and so they trip over each other when they talk through it. That I do think that we have to untether the conversation, and we have to go back, right? That it's not, we've got to talk about, all right, what's the problem beneath the problem? We do have to start with definitions. What do we mean? So I think to this question, there's 17 minutes and 20 seconds left on the back here. So I would say the best way to address this question is not with an answer necessarily that comes from the stage, because I guarantee you that even if you have a script, whatever conversation that you get into is not going to follow that script, right? It's with a framework, and it's doing kind of what was just done here. It's starting and asking more questions. It's these 3 magic words, all right? They're magic words. And the 3 words go like this: help me understand. Help me understand what you mean when you say this. And until you can repeat back what the person is saying, and they give you the compliment and confirmation, like, oh, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, then you're not ready to progress in the conversation. So my thought with a question like that is the best way to do it is patiently and very diagnostically, making sure that we're all on the same page, or else we're just going to talk past each other, and we're going to find ourselves in a contentious back and forth, even though we may not even be having the same conversation.
What I would add to that is that we can have that kind of conversation and still at the end of the conversation disagree.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes I'm not saying this is the case for the person who asked this question, but sometimes when we ask those kinds of questions, what we're really asking is, how do I convince them
Right.
that I'm right and they're wrong? And so I think sometimes a part of what we have to reckon with is that we can have a deep conversation where we understand each other at an intimate level, and at the end of the day, we don't believe the same thing, right? And so then the question becomes, how do I respect you and love you? And we sit with these differences and still understand that we serve the same God, right? So I think that piece is important too, that it doesn't always come to reconciliation or resolution. Understanding might be the final outcome.
Right.
I love that. It's not going, yeah, thank you. Come on, y'all give Doc a hand. I think that you're absolutely right. Resolution, reconciliation may not be the outcome, but respect should be.
Absolutely.
It should be the outcome, and we will be able to disagree without being discriminatory. Dr. Jeremiah Wright used to say, just because we're different doesn't mean that you're deficient. Because I could come out saying, hey, I agree in heterosexual relationships. There's a lot of quiet people in the room that feel that way, and they're scared to say it sometimes almost. That I believe in the biblical definition of marriage, and you stand on that, and you should stand on that if that's your conviction. But you should not stand on that as your conviction if you believe that gives you the right to harm somebody else who doesn't agree with that conviction. The church is quiet. See, that's where we're in trouble in this society.
Yeah.
That's where we're in trouble.
Right.
You can believe it, but just because I believe in Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior does not give me the right to harm a Muslim brother,
Right.
or harm a Buddhist brother. I mean, this conversation can be as broad as you want it to be.
Right.
You don't have to agree with me, but you don't have the right to use your power to oppress me.
Right.
That's where I'm trying to say that it is oppressive at the end of the day if you don't handle it right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would just add that it's important for us not to be coy with people. Clarity is kindness. And so if you are a part of a church, whether you are affirming or non-affirming as it relates to this particular topic, you owe it to people
Yeah.
to be able to articulate a cohesive theology of the position that you take, because it impacts people's lives. And so love makes us do work. love is a verb. It causes us to move and do things. So it will not be as easy as saying, because I said so. Oh, no. And even worse yet, to say, because God said so, if you have not done your due diligence and humility to do that. And the church just has to own that. There are major denominations right now splitting or preparing to split over the very topic that we're talking about right now, because it deeply matters, because we're talking about people's children. We're talking about people's selves, their own very identities. And so kindness looks like clarity in doing our due diligence to be able to answer those questions with integrity, and acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, but we are people that must be led by convictions. We have to have some kind of convictions in order to be trustworthy people, right? And so that is what I would be looking for, is a church that is able to give a comprehensive theology of its position on these matters in love. And the work of putting forth the comprehensive theology is an act of love, fueled by love for the purpose of reaching people in love.
And one of the things that I would say as it relates to a church is that often the churches or the leaders that have the most coy responses that are very hard and prickly around the edges are usually the people that do not have relationships with anybody that are a part of that community. That when some of your best friends are, getting married, and you have to sit and have the conversations, the hard ones that say, all the things that you love about me, the convictions and all that, all those things come from the same place that make me say, I love you with all of my heart, and I won't be able to come. And this how it's when you find somebody that speaks honestly to those things and can speak compassionately, those are the people that you want to listen to. Somebody that can speak very harshly without tears in their eyes about something so heart-wrenching is somebody that's unqualified to really, really share and to speak on it. These things affect people and relationships and families, and they deserve emotion-filled, tear-filled eyes.
Thank you. When leaving a church, how do you approach a conversation on how your pastor leadership has failed you, where it is respectful but encourages accountability?
So the first thing I would say is that people don't always take accountability. They don't, right? And so I think what my encouragement would be to enter that conversation with the goal of saying what your perspective was, but without depending upon the other person to show up in a certain way.
Right.
Because you can't count on them showing up even in the way you think they should. I was just talking with a client last week and she was like, I want this person to atone. I was like, I really understand why you want that. And let's have a contingency plan in case that doesn't happen. Right? Like we can't base our expectations upon other people's behavior because who we're in charge of is us. Right? So I would be really thoughtful about what do I want this person to know about my experience here, about how it impacted me. That's the piece that you have control over, right? And I think as much as you're able to clarify it for yourself, then you're able to deliver it in a way that has integrity. The really hard work but important work is separating that from the person's response to you. Because their response might not always match the same integrity or love that you're trying to offer it in, because people have their own stuff, right? So what you can do is clarify what your intentions are, and then if there are next steps that you're taking, to get clear on when and why you're doing that as well.
Can I share a personal story about when I did leave a space? I waited until I was a volcano. And I had held so much in for so many years that by the time I got ready to dip, it really wasn't a conversation to be had. It was a spewing of all that I had held in and all that I had suppressed, and by the time I was just over it. And my, warning to those of you that may be in that situation, stop waiting until you're so full and all you have is an eruption that you can't have a healthy conversation. Some of us hold too much in for too long. I know people at jobs where they'll sit in a meeting where the floor is open to say what you want to say, and we resolve to go have a conversation about a water cooler. Well, when the room was open to say whatever you needed to say, you didn't say it, but then the side conversations where no resolution can be formulated, I would just advise, don't wait until you're all the way over it to face it. Yeah. And so you give yourself and that person healthy, mature space to actually have a dialogue where you can listen and they can listen and give them a chance to reveal if they will be accountable or not. Sometimes we assume people won't be, and they may be. Right. Sometimes we assume that people will be and they won't. And you've got to become satisfied, as one post said, with the apology you'll never get. You have to accept the apology that you'll never receive sometimes. But at least you had space to have the conversation while you were still willing to listen.
Well, to both, I think, Pastor Reggie and to Dr. Jessica's point, when our healing is contingent upon the understanding of the person who harmed us, then we are in shackles. If they knew right to apologize, they probably wouldn't have done what they did to begin with, right? So sometimes we are working with people who have harmed us at a higher standard than they're operating on. Doesn't mean you don't deserve it, but you might want to use your time in some different ways in terms of caring for yourself. The other thing I would say is, and this is not so much from the individual standpoint, but from leaders who have the capacity to think about what exit interviews would look like. So I would hope we would not want churches that are cults, and which means that we have to think about people coming in and going out, right? People get to leave churches, right? If you don't have any paradigm to think about a healthy exit, then you might be dabbling in cultness, okay? And so we want to think about what it means for people to enter well and also to exit well in a restorative way, in a way better than when they came in, because we have to answer to God for how people leave our local churches. We would hope and pray that they leave better than when they came, healthier than when they came, with deeper self-compassion and deeper love and closeness to Jesus. But nevertheless, we need to have our way of thinking about an exit interview. So this is really more so of an institutional recommendation that pastors and leaders need to be thinking about how we assist people in exiting, which includes creating the feedback loops in humility that create the spaces for people to share what they really think about us, what they really think about that church. And that can be done in a couple different ways. Not everybody is going to muster up the courage to meet with a pastor face to face. but an anonymous survey. And if we are really committed to growing, recognizing that the church is not an organization, but an organism that must grow and must grow up, it's a process of maturation for every local church. And it's painful to mature as a local church. But we need to have feedback in order to know where we are going amiss. And so from an institutional standpoint, I would recommend that to people who are in a position of leadership and authority to make that happen, is to demonstrate that you are trustworthy and transparent by saying, you can tell me hard things. And that's easier said than done, because nobody likes criticism. And because those of us who've worked in church environment, we know that people put in hours, they make sacrifices, their children make sacrifices that the average church member knows nothing about, nor recognizes or maybe even cares. And yet and still, with great responsibility, with great authority comes great responsibility, y'all. And so that means creating these systems where you sometimes hear things that don't feel fair to you, and they may not be fair, but nevertheless creating those systems so that we can have feedback so that we can grow.
Next question. How would you defend the value of church when we're seeing people more publicly talk about their church hurt? How would you defend the value of church when we're seeing people more publicly talk about their church hurt?
I would start off and say, we always have to remember that the virtue of a thing is never eliminated by its abuses. So I think the virtue of a thing is never removed because of its abuses. And I think we do live in a church that would look and say, look at the repeated abuses, therefore this thing doesn't have value. And I just think that we have to start off the conversation and not define the goodness of a thing by its abuses. But we have to remember that the goodness of a thing often causes people that are maybe wicked or undiscerning to want to abuse it. The reason why counterfeit money exists is because the actual dollar is so valuable. If it wasn't valuable, nobody would mess with it or try to recreate it or try to pass things off or try to cheat folks out of it. So I do think that we have to start the conversation and not let the abuses be the starting point of the, goodness of the thing.
And what I would say related to defending the church is we can show people better than we can tell them, right? And so if we are going to be a part of the church, then the question for me as an individual, everywhere I show up in the world is, if I'm a representative of the church, am I doing it justice? Right? What do my daily interactions with people look like? And when people find out I'm a believer, does that make them more curious about God and faith, or make them want to turn around and walk away, right? And if each of us have that individual accountability, as Dr. Christina was saying, then we grow up, we grow better, because we're all oriented toward, how do I operate in this life of faith in a way that really honors God and isn't just about my own wants and desires and, search for power or whatever that we human beings do.
One more thing that I would just add real quick. If the church dealt with its own issues before it came to light, people would tend to trust the church more, because we would stop being a community that pretends like sin doesn't still exist inside. And they say, oh, no, look. In the rest of the world, the indictment's going to come when the video releases. But at least with this church, they're taking care of their own before things come out, and they show that they really believe about the redemption and hope and grace that they talk through. So.
Amen. When we don't practice church discipline as it's defined biblically, not the stuff that we make up where we drag a pregnant teen girl to the front of the church to humiliate her, but when church discipline is about people being accountable to the power that they have and their misuse of it, when we don't do that, we tempt people to go to social media, to CNN, right? We tempt people to get justice that they should have in the church outside of the church. And they are not wrong to seek justice. That's a part of what it means to be an image bearer of our God, is to have a sense of intrinsic dignity. It is right and good to want justice. And so when we don't have those systems in place in the local church, then people are going to try to find it somewhere. Church discipline, which is a word I know we don't talk about a whole lot, but I'm going to talk about it right now, is that church discipline is incredibly important. It's something that I would be recommending to people that they should ask about when they're joining a church. Who holds you accountable? Who do you submit to? Because I'm here to submit and learn and grow, but I need to know, who do you learn from? Who are you submitting to? And what is my recourse if there is not just disappointment, but if there's an abuse of power? What are the steps and procedures to handle that? What does accountability look like in this local church? And this is the entry conversation that we need to start having. Now, if you're working with a pastor or ministers who the idea of even those questions offends them, if they say, how dare you? If you want to have, if you're a woman, a single woman, and maybe you don't feel comfortable meeting with a male pastor alone, and they are offended by that statement, then you already know what you're working with. You already know what you're working with. So humility means that we meet people where we are. We recognize that we don't have all the answers. And we try to create systems in place that recognize that unchecked power is corruptive. Yeah. And that only God, only the divine, only God is capable of holding all power without corruption. All the rest of us, we could take a little bit of swig of power and cut up, right? So to the extent that we have power, that is the extent that we must have accountability. They have to be correlated. And I would be asking questions like that when entering into a local church.
All right, would you join me in thanking our panel? And as a reminder before we go, please be sure to drop by the Whole Brother Mission table for resources on mental health for you personally, your church, and also a book on processing through church hurt. Thank you.